All right, so welcome everybody to today's episode. I'm your host, Nathaniel Sad, and I'm joined by Greg Kelley, the member of the National Assembly of Quebec and representative of the Jacques-Cartier riding. Greg, thank you for being here. How are you?
Thanks, Nate. It's a real pleasure to be on the show. And, I guess I'm doing about as well as anyone can be doing in these very troubling and uncertain times.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of things going on, lots of activity and events, lots to discuss. So we're just going to jump right in, specifically with the events that have been going on, not just in Montreal, but across the world. As most of you know, the Black Lives Matter movement is taking the globe by storm, and protests are happening everywhere. So according to an independent study that I wanted to bring to everyone's attention, Black and Indigenous people are 4 to 5 times more likely to be stopped and asked to identify themselves by police in Montreal. Now, what steps do you think are necessary to stop this type of bias and discrimination in our communities?
So at least I'll start with one thing, and I'll talk about society at large. I think that there definitely needs to be a change in some of our education curriculum as we're growing up, right? I know that especially on the side of Indigenous, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said that there should be more Indigenous, not just content, but learning about the history of Indigenous people through their lens taught in our schools across Canada. And I know that there have been a lot of people from the Black community who have advocated for the same thing. And I've also heard, too, on this side that I've had a few emails and calls about the Quebec curriculum that talk to me about how the Holocaust is overlooked in the course material. So that kind of me also goes to show that perhaps our history courses, our civic education could be expanded. I think that would go a long way for people to better understand where everyone is coming from and where some of these frustrations and social tensions that exist come from. But again, also that will just, if we're more educated, we're always better at understanding one another. So I think that as a large part of that needs to come from individuals themselves, and increased campaigns by government about hate, discrimination, intolerance, and racism. It's just an uphill battle, but it's a continuous one we have to do. And every day, if we can change at least one person's mind and, their better understanding, we'll be a better society for it. If I look more specifically at policing itself, I mean, it's a tough question right now because I spoke to a few of my friends who are police officers who said they do sensitivity training. So then you kind of ask yourself, then what is maybe lacking? And maybe it does go back even for police officers themselves to maybe the second that they enter at John Abbott Police Tech, for example, they do take more of the larger history, political science courses to kind of get an understanding of, the trends in society, do specific courses on the cultural sensitivities. Maybe that would help. I think that there's no police force out there that would ever turn itself down to further training and learning more. And again, once that's there, we can go from there. And I think another part that's just key is that we do end up forming these committees in government, and what do they really produce? So I think at least on our end as politicians and a government, sometimes we just create these working groups that don't go very far. There's a white paper coming out from the government on policing in Quebec. This was an initiative launched by the CAC 2 years ago. The minister said that there'll be a part in there about, racism, discrimination, intolerance. So I'm really curious to see how that goes. And, we've been asking questions in the House about who she's been speaking to about this, and it remains pretty vague. But we have a shot right now to maybe make a difference in how our police operate in this province. And I hope we seize it. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. But I'm a little bit, I would say, at least, how can we do better with police? There's another thing, too, that maybe would keep them a little bit more, I don't want to keep them a little bit more on their toes, I guess, is if we had better data collection of every time there was somebody stopped. Like these studies have to be done, and sometimes very hard to get all that information. But if the police force itself kept statistics on themselves, maybe that would also go a long way to keeping them in check, and rethinking some of their practices and leading to better outcomes. So that's kind of where I can see some pathways forward to maybe making an improvement. But we've talked about this before, so it will take also a lot of will from police forces, governments to put these things into place and make sure they work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can definitely say as a student myself, having gone through the Quebec curriculums and all the history classes that we took, there's a lot of material, but there's definitely more that can be added.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in terms of short, oh, sorry, yeah, go for it.
No, and I was going to say, like, and I guess I think there definitely should be more. I actually read the new history curriculum, and it was put into place by the PQ. And at least on the way that the course, because we have to remember across Quebec, not everyone is a historian who teaches history. So the teachers from the last type of content we had, the last curriculum, apparently it wasn't very easy to teach, and the way that it was broken down was a bit confusing. So at least the new curriculum and how it is laid out, teachers enjoy how it's much easier to use. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what's in there is correct. And again, I know that our previous government, the Liberals, tried to add some more content for Indigenous people into it, but it still just doesn't seem like it's enough. So again, there's a lot of educators out there that can provide us good solutions. And also, too, schools have to go out once in a while and try to find experts to come in and talk. You're allowed to do that because, I mean, a teacher could do it, but if you could actually hear from somebody from the Black community of Montreal or hear from an Indigenous person and some of those organizations, I think that would go a long way to, you know, opening eyes in school. So I'm in agreement with you. And like, I mean, you went through high school a little more recently than I, but even when I was going through, I kind of remembered in my history classes asking my dad a lot of questions, being like, "Well, Dad, we don't talk so much about this and that." So sometimes the history in Quebec is, I guess, sort of jaded towards the more kind of nationalistic story, which is not necessarily incorrect in terms of history content, but it's maybe not giving us the full background of what happened in our history so that we just better understand one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, these things are needed for sure for the long term, but in terms of short-term results, there's a lot of things going on these days, especially with all the protesting. And I want to know what you think of that, the idea of thousands of people gathering in the streets to advocate for something that they want. Do you believe that that type of thing can result in actual change?
I think that protesting can push society in a direction to respond to what the protesters are upset about. And I would say that there are some, it's interesting that when this happens, then some things kind of come out in discussions in the press. One that I've seen, again, is body cams. And I'm, in a sense, I mean, it's sad that we're having this situation, but I'm happy the subject about body cams on police officers is coming back up. I tabled a petition, Nate, about my first year that came from Tracy Wing, who's lives out in Brome, and her son was shot by the police after he had mental health issues, and he was a 19-year-old kid, real young. And anyways, there was an unfortunate situation. He was shot by the police, and the whole circumstances about why the police weren't able to calm him down remains pretty unclear. So she had worked on a petition asking that all police forces in Quebec have a body cam, and there are cameras in police cruisers. And I always thought, after talking to some police officers, they all found that it was maybe a way to provide better transparency when there's interactions between civilians and police officers. So I was like, well, maybe now, again, we need to start doing something. And I feel like that is a pretty simple solution that we could put into place across Quebec, right? And then I think on some of those other things we're talking about, like education, again, it brings it to the forefront that maybe we need to have a better understanding of where we're coming from. But it does bring into the forefront, you know, the fact that if we look at all of those high postings of Hydro-Quebec, Lotto-Quebec, you know, all those prime jobs, there's not really any diversity in there. It brings up questions, too, of data gathering. And, you know, like with COVID, Quebec's not taking any data based on cultural communities, which in the United States they're doing, because there seems to be an issue right now that the most hardest hit communities are the Black and Hispanic communities in America. So you want to track these things to better understand it. And it brings all that to the forefront. And I think that there are some of those things we'll be able to get done and probably push for the government to resolve. And so in a way, I do think that protesting goes out there and can make change and raise tons of awareness, bring the discussion to the forefront, a discussion that we really do need to have.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And, you know, it's interesting that you say that, because as hundreds of people gather downtown to fight for what they believe in, it's unfortunate, but a lot of people tend to take advantage of that situation to go downtown and merge with the protesters, but then they end up looting from stores and stealing from businesses. What effect do you think that has on the movement in general?
I think, in the looting, of course, it's unacceptable, and there are professional protesters. I mean, almost every single year when there's the police brutality protest in Montreal, it always starts out usually pretty calm and people making their point, and then there's a group that goes out and does vandalize. And I don't think it's just disappointing because the front page of the Journal de Montréal after that protest happened last Sunday, that was what the story was. That there was a store that was looted, and it wasn't on the point of what the protesters are trying to make. So I think it does, and I'll look to the, case in the United States. I think that the looting and the violence really helped to play into Donald Trump's hands for his law and order message. That when he went out there with the military police and the police forces to do his little photo op, the majority of us that, people that I know, of course, were disgusted, but the ones that support Donald Trump really like that message, right? So I know that protesters after that, organizers really tried to shift and say, look, anyone that we don't really recognize or is advocating violence, we're going to get rid of it. Because also, too, a lot of that violence that takes place, and again, I go back more to the case of the United States, it's happening in their own community. So people are sort of saying, we just trashed and burned down a business in our own neighborhood, and that business might never come back. Those are our neighbors and friends. So there, and I understand though where, especially in the United States, where that anger came from. I mean, for them, and the socioeconomic, issues in the States are enormous, and it's just they have like a very large history of this type of protest evolving into violence. So you could see where the frustration and anger was coming from, but it seems like protest organizers after that tried to really rein things in. And it's not to say that here in Canada we don't have a history of that at all, but even on that scale, the looting and rioting we saw was not similar to what we saw in some of those American cities where it was really bad, right? I mean, it was quite widespread. But I do think that in the end, it does take away from the most important messages that the peaceful demonstrators are trying to get across.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, as much as we want to try and stop, the what's the word I'm looking for? Like kind of taking away from what the main message is. This happens all the time, and it's really something that needs to be avoided. Yeah. So if you had any advice for the people that are going downtown to protest, or those who want to advocate against the issues of racial discrimination and police brutality, what would you say to them? Well,
I mean, I'll always kind of pay close attention. Yesterday when I was there from 10 to 11, the crowd started to get bigger, but right at the start, they had the speeches from some of the organizers and really powerful messages that I think were important to hear. The marching was great, but I think understanding the message is key. So, I mean, a little bit, just get there on time and be there for those key moments. But again, also just respect, you have a right to protest, but you don't have a right to go out and, destroy people's property either, right? So just stay within that. And people when they see peaceful protests, large demonstrations, it captures the imagination of everyone else. And look, here in Montreal, we might have a pretty good understanding of the issue of systemic racism, the issue of discrimination and hate. But we need to make sure that in the regions of Quebec, people see our message, right? That there are people out in, Sherbrooke, there's people out in the Saguenay. They're understanding that this type of discrimination impacts them too, and that it can exist anywhere in this province. So we have to make sure that we have a message that, the protesters have a message going out there that is positive and powerful. So that would just be my suggestion is, do that. And if it ever does start to de-escalate into violence, to really try to avoid that, just because it could be dangerous for yourself. People have been, very seriously injured. I think of the student protests back in those days. People lost an eye. They were, blown out eardrums. So if it ever really does start to de-escalate to that level of violence, be very cautious, and you might not want to be there for that part.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. And let's hope that with everything that's going on, things start to work in the right direction and we get the change we need.
Yeah. And look, it's always hard because change sometimes is a slow process just because government doesn't operate extremely quickly all the time. But I think we just have to kind of pick our points, and there's a reality that we all just have to take into consideration that there's a lot of us who I'd say, systemic racism exists. For me, I can just point very simply, for anyone who says, no, that's not the case, we'll be like, well, just look at the Indian Act here in Canada. It's a racist piece of legislation. That's not coming from Greg Kelley's analysis. That has been clearly identified by many people. I know replacing it is a little bit trickier than just saying that it's a racist piece of act, but that is just something that has discriminated and systemically discriminated and against people for, now I guess the act is over 100 years. It has been changed on occasion, but there's still parts of it too that are just unacceptable. So it does exist, and the real thing is that just because there's systemic racism doesn't mean that people are systematically racist. It's not to mean that everyone is racist, but there are some issues there that we just have to sit down, address it seriously. But like I said, the key is to making sure that the rest of the province understands. And a thing that really kind of struck me that I heard over the weekend is that in Quebec City, the second largest police force in the entire province, there's not a single Black police officer. And that's just shocking because there is a Black community in Quebec City, and you're just it's just super strange. And again, that goes to my point too, finding more place for Indigenous people in our police forces, finding more place for people of color in our police forces will help a lot too. People who understand the communities that they're serving. I think that's extremely important, is that, policing focuses on that, having more people from their local communities in their local police forces.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. And that's all the time that we have today. So that concludes our episode.
No problem, Nate. This was a lot of fun. And I'm happy to come back onto your show anytime you want to chit chat.
Awesome. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
Everybody.
Take care, Nate.